right, so we'll jump in. All right, what's the goal of all Christian instruction? Amen. And so in your small groups, you guys are going to ask the question, how have you seen God acting as a parent in your life? And how has he shown you he's a father or a mother hen? So talk amongst yourselves. Robin, what was your answer when we did this?
I think my answer was around like disciplining, like seeing God as the person that holds the
Disciplines.
rules. And, yeah.
Is that a good thing?
I think in different seasons.
Because you like rules?
Not really. And so I think it wasn't that thing. It's like the disappointed in you, like Father, when you've done something wrong.
Where are you now?
Less like that. More like rules are there for a purpose. We've learned a lot that there, that God doesn't make rules just for fun. That like we've talked about with lying. Like God doesn't say don't lie to each other just because you're not supposed to, but because it breaks relationship.
Yep.
But there's like a deeper understanding of, I don't know, sin and rules and all that.
Yeah, it's good. Well, you make sure it's recording.
Sure.
Just look at it. Because if this messes up, we'll never do it. Check, 1, 2, okay. Yeah, it's done. It's now or never. I will never talk about the widows ever again after this. Yeah. Okay. For those of you listening at home on YouTube who have this, I want you to take a moment, and I know sometimes I say this, and maybe if you're listening in your car or whatever, you're like, yeah, right, and you press through. Again, rules are there to control the fun, if you believe that. But this one I really want you to think about, because this is going to set the tone for today. So the question is, have you ever thought about a biblical passage meant one thing, and then you changed your mind in a significant way? So you thought it meant this, and you think it means this. So I want you to think about what was that passage, but more than the passage. So I want you, you have to think of it, because I want you to think, but what was it that changed your mind? How did you go from believing, I don't know, that it was, I don't even have I have changed my mind on so many things. I have 1,000 examples swirling in my head. The widows for me would be the example, and you're going to see today how I changed my mind. And so that's why I'm asking this question. But I want you to take a moment, and I want you to think about, were there people that influenced you, works that influenced you, books, teaching, what was it that made you change your mind? Because I want you to know and think it is possible to change your mind on pretty big things. Because I'm going to try and I'm willing to bet I'm going to change your mind. If you change your mind tonight, I don't think anybody starts where I'm at on this topic, and then I want to bring you where I'm at. So we'll see if I can get you there. But if not, I'll at least have you scratching your head. So what we're talking about is I'm going to read to you the passage, okay? So if you remember in 1 Timothy, we've been going through this letter, and one of the things that happens in this letter is Paul's giving instructions to his young pastor on how to set up the church. We've already had passages about the overseers, if y'all remember that, right? There was sort of the qualifications for them. And then we had qualifications for deacons or deaconesses, and we talked about those. Tonight, we're going to look at this passage on widows and elders. The historic view is that widow is a station in life, and then elder, so it's sort of like we look at overseers who are in office, deacons who are in office, widow, a station in life, and then back into elders. And so I'm going to read the passage to us, and then I'm going to talk about these two main interpretations, and then I'm going to walk you through how we change our mind about the Bible, because it's really hard to do that. I said the other day, and one of my students keeps re-quoting me on Facebook, that theology is inherently dangerous because at some point you disagree with your grandma or your youth pastor or the person who married you or somebody that's really important to you, because theology does force you to change your mind over time. But so many times ideas have with them an allegiance to a person, not just an idea. So I'm setting the groundwork so you guys will understand why I'm doing this. And part of the reason why I'm doing this is the second time I've taught this. And when I finished it the first time, Robin said to me, I didn't think when you were starting that, I didn't think this had anything to do with anything important. And I thought, what a colossal waste of time. And so I want you to trust me that I'm taking us somewhere. So I just want to address that now. So we're going to really only talk about the widows. We're going to ignore the elders for today. But this is what the passage says. And so I want you to think about the two main interpretations of this section. And this is the main one that people have put forward, is this is a list of women in need. And therefore, those who can remarry or be supported by their families should, because the church cannot support all the widows. That should say cannot. The second interpretation is this is about widows in need as well as widows who serve the church as an office and have the same qualifications as overseers and on the church payroll, so to speak. So I'm going to read to you the translation that I have here, and then we're going to dive in. So, honor widows who are truly in need. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, they should first learn to fulfill their duty toward their own household and so repay their parents what is owed them. For this is what pleases God. But the widow who's truly in need and completely on her own has set her hope on God and continues in her pleas and prayers night and day. But the one who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. Reinforce these commands so that they will be beyond reproach. But if someone does not provide for his own, especially his own family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. No widow should be put on the list unless she's at least 60 years old, was the wife of one husband, and has a reputation for good works, as one who's raised children, practiced hospitality, washed the feet of the saints, helped those in distress, and as one who has exhibited all kinds of good works. But do not accept younger widows on the list, because their passions may lead them away from Christ, and they will desire to marry, and so incur judgment for breaking their former pledge. And besides that, going around from house to house, remember that phrase, they learn to be lazy, and they're not lazy, but also gossip and busybodies. Remember that phrase too, because we're going to come back to it. Talking about these things they should not. So I want younger women to marry, raise children, manage a household, we're going to come back to that, in order to give the adversary no opportunity to vilify us. For some have already wandered away to follow Satan. If a believing woman has widows in her family, let her help them. The church should not be burdened, so that it may help the widows who are truly in need. So that's 1 Timothy, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so going back, you read this and you kind of go, okay, based on that interpretation, it feels like view number one is almost a slam dunk if you're going to do the plain reading of the text. But I don't believe in a plain reading of the text. So here we go. Before we jump in, though, and I take you on this journey with me that Robin thought was winding but had to pay off, so you just have to trust me. The reason why she thought this is because I set it up with how do we change our mind? And so when we're studying passage like this, and that's a pretty big different way of understanding it. Like one's like these women who are bereaved of their husbands who need financial care and spiritual care, as opposed to like women who are going to serve in an official capacity like an overseer. Like those are two very different interpretations. So how do we arrive at different ways of understanding it? So just in general, whether we're doing it on this passage or any passage, first of all, you put aside bias as best you can. Okay, you can never put it aside. So just name them, right? The reality is any passage that has women, I'm going to always I want to lean toward the women have greater freedom, opportunity, privilege, all of it. I'm just going to do that. Like that's going to be my bias. People who come from a complementarian camp, they're going to lean the other way because it's going to make them uncomfortable, right? And so you can never remove I can never read the Bible as anything other than a middle-class white woman, older millennial that feels 150 years old. Like that's just how I come to the passage. And my theological training is from very niche places that I bring that set of information with me. I cannot put that aside. But so rather than saying like this absurd thing was like try to be objective, you can't. Like there's no such thing. Instead, name your biases as best you can. Some of them I won't even be able to name. Some of them I've had to come to like painfully realize I carried those with me. But you can control being willing to be curious, thoughtful, and charitable. So you can approach commentaries going, hey, I feel like I'm already going to disagree with this guy because he's from Southern Seminary, and I'm probably not going to like what he has to say. But you know what? He's a legitimate scholar. He got his PhD. That's hard work. Like, I'm going to read what he has to say and try to weigh his argument based on that. So that would be an example of how to do that. But also, while being charitable, also consider what the other camps have to gain. There's no professor at Southern Seminary who can arrive at the second conclusion. So like, I also have to be like somewhat wise and shrewd in my understanding to say, look, there's too much to break away. So I'm probably only going to read one commentary from that camp because they're all going to say the same thing. And so that's going to have a bias that I have to also know. Be willing to read broadly, and I think nowadays, this really includes reading international commentaries. They've come a long way. 20 years ago, you couldn't. Like, if you were like, who's a African scholar writing on 1 Timothy? While that was happening, they weren't getting published. But thankfully, people are starting to move in those initiatives, and so they're out there. So yeah, be willing to read broadly, outside your tradition, things like that. And then be committed to the truth. Regardless of what you like or what you want, the goal is, what's the truth? Because the truth is housed in a person, not an idea. And so that's going to require humility. I hate being wrong. And if I'm being honest with y'all, like the first time I heard Sandy's idea, I saw all this from Sandy Glahn, Dr. Sandy Glahn. And honestly, the first time I heard her talk about it, I was like, I don't think so. And a part of that is probably because I didn't want to be wrong. Like, I don't like changing my mind. Even with someone who I think is the godmother of theology, like the woman that I would like kill and die for, and I'm still like, I don't really like it when you tell me I'm wrong. I just prefer when you tell me I was right, what I already thought about. So, just keeping those things in mind. Logistically, the way we look at it is vocabulary is huge. And that's why I kept saying pay attention to these words, because we're going to go back to those words. And what's hard is we have to trust our English translation to some degree. Like, we can't always assume, like, none of it's right. But some words in the Greek have such a pregnant, like, meaning that's in some ways you have to be a little skeptical to go, is there another way we could have translated this? Is this not so straightforward? So one of the ways we change our mind about passages is we look at the vocabulary and say, okay, how are these ideas, words, phrases used elsewhere by this author and in the scriptures? And this is going to come up huge in our passage here. And when I told everybody what one of those words meant in another passage that's tied to our church in Ephesus, like, I think people got mad. And so I was like, there it is. And then not only do we look at vocab, but we also say, okay, what does Acts in the Old Testament also teach us about this place in this letter? Like, we're looking, the Bible tends to have reverberation all the way through. And so we're kind of going, okay, have we seen this before, seen something like this before? And then how did the early church interpret this passage? So one of the things that's really helpful is to look at reception history. And reception history is just a fancy way of saying, like, how have the people throughout church history, when they read 1 Timothy 5, what did they say? Like, what's the most natural sense for them? Because they're a whole lot closer. They would have a much better understanding. And then what does the newer archaeology show us? And this is where, this is that whole book that we've been spending this class on. So much of what Sandy's been able to glean out of that is from the archaeology. And so she also writes about, like, prostitutes and shaved heads. It used to be believed prostitutes had shaved heads. That's why Paul tells the women in Corinth to, like, grow their hair out or whatever. But that's not true, actually. So then it's like, we've been saying this forever, and then now we have all this archaeology, and we're like, yeah, we don't know what we're talking about. So the newer archaeology that we're digging up today helps us. And then a big question we always have to ask is, like, how does this interpretation impact my understanding of God, his church, and the gospel? And I'm going to argue that if you take the first view, that these are women in need, your view of the church gets a little sticky in this passage, because you're basically saying the church makes people be excellent before they will give them need. And we'll see that as we go on. And so this is one of those things, too, that I'd go, hey, back out and go, okay, so if this is my view, what's the logical conclusion that this is going to draw out about the character of God, the character of his people, the gospel, the good news? If you're ever violating the character of God, what God says about his own church, or good, if your interpretation is not good news, it's probably not the right interpretation. Or just keep digging, like keep going. And so these are the ways that we look at these things. And then, of course, context. And in our case, the beautiful thing about the letters of Paul, and even a little bit of Peter, is that we tend to have some narrative in Acts that helps us say, okay, what's happening here that might shed light on those letters? And there's no place more so true, I think, than Ephesus. We have such an extended amount of time where Paul's in Ephesus. And so I want to remind y'all, in that story in Ephesus, Paul goes and he shares the gospel, and a bunch of people burn their books because they were full of, do y'all remember the word? Magic. They burned their magic books. I want you to remember this. And Paul has such success that people start praying, like shawls that he touched and he prayed over were sent out, and people were getting healed. And then the people get mad, and there's that massive riot, okay? But magic was a huge part of the Acts story that all these people went. Normally, I'm an anti-book burner, but, in this case, this is like, okay, this seems good. Also, I wrote a doctoral paper. Do you remember when I wrote a doctoral paper on, like, writing habits of the first century? And people were like, it was too expensive to have material. I'm like, if people are out in the streets burning books when we know you can scrape them and write over them, they're not as expensive as you think. Like, I'd have been, like, pulling them out of the fire and been like, hey, and, like, so, yeah, exactly. So I was like, and so I wrote this whole paper about our understanding of the cost of parchment or papyrus was because a guy saw a price for a roll and he thought it was price per sheet. And so, like, the metaphor was like, imagine you give a list to, like, a new kindergartner's family, and you're like, those 50-page Mead notebooks are like $1 a page. So suddenly that's a $50 notebook, and I'm like, no, it's $1 for all 50 pages. That's a different level of affordability. When you're like, you need 5 of these, and you're like, $250 for notebooks? You're like, no, $5. Like, that's the difference. And so, anyways, people are silly. They don't read their footnotes. Okay, if that's how we change our mind, we're going to jump in and I'm going to say, okay, is this a station in life, an office, title, or both? Now, I'm going to argue it is both. I think Paul's addressing both here. There are some widows that he's like, they're genuinely in need. You see that in the first paragraph, and their family should take care of them. And if you don't take care of your family, you're worse than a non-believer. But then we see this switch happen in that second paragraph, and he starts talking about qualifications. And so, again, I stole all of this from Sandra Gaughan's ETS paper from 2021. Made me feel better. But honestly, y'all, I mean, truly, the first time I heard her, I was like, I don't know. You read that? Did you not read it? I read it. And then the more I was reading her argument and the more the archaeology came out, I was like, yeah, I think you're probably right. So if at the end of this, you're not convinced, you will be someday is my point. Just hang with it. And no, I'm just kidding. Okay, so evidence for widows. So I am not going to argue for the first view. It's out there. You don't need my help. Pick a commentary. It'll argue for it. So I'm only going to argue that it's an office and a station in life. And so that's the argument as we go through. So some of these are going to feel like random pieces, and then I'm going to pull them all together for you. So first things first. Paul likes familial and subservient language for leaders in the church. So to take the title widow and use it as an office would not be out of the ordinary. Like later he's going to use elder. Elder in the first century just kind of means an old guy in the family. It doesn't have a special religious meaning until we take it and make it what it is today. And so same thing like deacon. It's just a servant. It's not a special word until later when we import all this meaning into it. And so this idea that he would use terms found in the family for offices already has a place in this very letter. And notice he doesn't use master or leader, and he very rarely uses power verbs like rule. So if you're going to give a title specifically to a woman who's the female ruling leader, but you avoid powerful terms, widow would actually track, because what else would you call her? And so Paul says to give honor to these widows, and this same word for honor is the same word that he'll use later with elders, and he talks about giving them a double honor. And in that context, he's talking about financial compensation. So he's saying, listen, I want you to give the widow's honor, and I want you to give the elders double honor, which we got 70 cents on the dollar, so we've made it a little bit farther than Paul's 50 cents on the dollar. Yeah. I can only assume those fellas had families they had to pay for, but whatever, Paul, we'll get there. There's a way to, Paul gets such a bad rap, and I'm like, some of that's deserved. And then some of that is I'm like, man, if I were to land on this side of something, I'm like, he's pretty radical. But there are moments when I'm like, I don't love that. But the elders, the reason why they're getting a double honor is especially those who lead well in word and deed. So again, elders are getting this compensation for serving the church. And so it's interesting that it's the exact same word that he's going to use just a few verses down. And so that's the question is this what he has in mind here? Or why would he 12 verses later mean something completely different with the exact same Greek word is the question. Widow. So we hear widow, and what do you think when you hear that word? What does it mean to us in English? Yeah. Had a husband, and then he passed away. Yeah, exactly. And there's nothing beyond that in English as far as I know. I've never heard it used any other way. Well, widow in the first century actually has a much broader meaning. And so it has the root for forsaken, and it's not just a woman bereft of a husband, so not just a woman who's lost a husband, but any woman living without a husband. It's really fascinating. It's actually a bigger catch-all word. And so Philo, and he's a contemporary of the first century, he talks about virgins who become widows. So in other words, when you're young and you're sort of pre-married, you're a virgin because you're going to presumably become married and lose your virginity. But then they never get married, but they're older. And so spinster is a word that doesn't come until the 1800s. Old maid is the 1800s. So what's the word for a younger woman becoming older without a husband involved? For Philo, it was widow. Ignatius says the same thing. He writes and he says he salutes the virgins who are called widows. And so Sandy looked across, the Koine Greek is the Greek of the first century. It's like a speaking Greek. There's a classical Greek, which is a little bit fancier. Luke likes to use classical Greek because he's a doctor. So if you ever go to seminary, you do not want to be assigned a passage from Luke or Acts. You want John. You want that fisherman Greek, but it's much easier. And so, but no word existed in Koine Greek for a woman who is older and never married. And we think that is so rare, but we actually have the evidence that the sine manu, the woman without a husband, is actually not that rare. And then think about where we're at. What do we know about Ephesus? What do we know about Artemis? she never married. So suddenly you're talking about a place with a larger percentage of women who never married. They would be called widow in the same way that a woman who is bereft of a husband. So Paul says to enroll actual widows, okay? So he says only actual widows. This word enroll, that's a fascinating word so again, we go back to vocabulary. The word enroll, according to the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, which is pretty good, it actually means to be adopted into a fellowship by election. So you're kind of like, okay, adopted in through a vote, and the antonym is to vote someone down. So to say, like, if you were talking about we're like, hey, church body, we're gonna vote on Robin, all in favor, A, and whatever. That's weird language for someone who's just in need. Like, that's not how you, like, I hope none of your churches, like, bring her up, or, oh, we found this homeless woman, anybody want to vote real quick? That's a bizarre way to talk about it. And it's kept in language often given for people who are being, in the civic society, voted into positions of influence within those civic society. So taking the fact that widows will be given a financial compensation with honor will be decided by the congregation. Again, this feels less like a charity case and more like an office of ministry. I just think, like, truly, if this is how we did charity, if this is what we're supposed to do for charity, I don't see anybody doing it. So either we're being unfaithful with this or we've always been uncomfortable with whatever Paul's saying here. And then Paul will lay out the qualifications for the women on the list. But elsewhere, he encourages generosity without qualification. So in Romans 12, 15, 26, Galatians 2, you don't hear him say, hey, like, we're raising these funds. Now make sure you vet them. Make sure they're honorable people. Like, he just does that. So it's fascinating that here, if it's women in need, it's odd that he gives these qualifications. Now, here's the really interesting part. If you look at the qualifications, for widows, and you go back a couple chapters for overseers, they have a lot of parallelism. So if you remember back to our overseers, they need to be older. And for the overseers, it was like, hey, because we don't want them to be arrogant. They need to have been spouses of one husband, or when it says husband of one wife, and we talked about the different interpretations of that, it doesn't necessarily mean like not divorced or not remarried, but you are one woman kind of man. That seems to be the similar idea here. You have a good reputation among the community. You were a good parent to children, and you have shown hospitality. And hospitality is one of the highest values in the ancient world. It's amazing today, like we today devalue hospitality so much. Like it's like someone shows up and they want to serve, and you don't know what gifts they have, and you're like, oh, you can be on the hospitality team. But like in the ancient world, that's bananas. Like that would be the highest. And so it's fascinating that the highest office in the church, this is the kind of person you're supposed to be right here. And then you get to widow 2 chapters later, and it's the same kind of person. And again, if this is what's required to lead the church, and this is what's required to receive aid from the church, you'd just be like, thank God we're in the middle, okay? Like, thank God no one's looking at us. So it's odd that we would say this is for charity cases. Paul says he wants younger widows to get married. So this is fascinating. This is, I think, has Artemis written all over it. I think he would say something else in Corinth. He does. That's me being cheeky. I know he does. And so it's fascinating here when he's talking about the widows. He still has this moment when he says, I want younger ones to get remarried. But he says the reason why is if younger widows become widows of the church, in this argument that I'm making, he's worried they'll break their pledge and be drawn away. And so the question has been, what pledge is he even talking about? Like, what are... and so multiple options here, but perhaps the vow to remain married to Christ. So you take on this office and you say, hey, I'm making a commitment to the church and to Christ, which only someone mature and committed can make and keep. Some believe this becomes the precursor for nuns. That they say, okay, this is the vow that Paul was talking about here for these widows. And so now we as nuns are making that same one. And he's saying, like, you can't say, hey, I'm pledging my entire life to Christ. And then you're like, oh, Adonis is looking good today. And then like, he's just saying, if you're the kind of person that can be moved in those passions, most likely you're not ready to be serving the church in this capacity, is what many people think he's doing here. But he's also worried about younger widows because they're idle and gossiping busybodies. And then I wrote, or are they? Okay, so this is where, again, vocabulary is so important. And this is where I think Megan got mad. So yeah. So this word, this phrase here, idle and gossiping busybodies. He's like, hey, I'm worried about them. Okay, quick reminder. Again, he was on mission in Ephesus, and we just talked about there was magicians who renounced their ways and burned their books. What's fascinating about the first century Greco-Roman world, magic is actually outlawed in every city but one. You want to guess which city it was? Yeah, it was Ephesus. Yeah, you have guessed it. And so what's fascinating is actually the Roman leaders said this magic is ridiculous, and so they outlawed it. But there was a really good friend of the emperor who was a magician, and he's from Ephesus. And so they just had their own little special magic is in Ephesus, but nowhere else. So the fact that magic shows up at all in the New Testament, it shows up in Ephesus, is really fascinating. So you say, okay, what does that have to do with idle and gossiping busybodies? Well, the phrase gossip and busybodies actually can be translated as those who practice magic. Yeah, there it is. So if we go back to what I said about vocab, you look at how it's used in the same spaces and places in Acts 19:19, where the story about the magicians take place. The same word for busybodies, that para-ergos, is the same word used in magic here. What's fascinating is Luke's like, hey, we got this para-ergos problem here. And then Paul's writing to Tim in the exact same city, and we say, oh, no, the women, they're gossips. Which I know this has to do with a little bit of misogyny, but men are the biggest gossips, okay? Like, I've been in ministry a long time. Men love the tea, and half the time they're stirring the pot. So gossip is not just a female thing. And in fact, like, I think almost because women are told we're gossips, we almost are more aware of the fact, like, I don't think men realize they're gossiping half the time, where I'm like, you're not supposed to share that, but all right. And so all that to say, it's fascinating. The exact same word in the context of Ephesus about magic is the same word Paul's writing to Timothy. And then I want you to remind you, Paul is already writing to Timothy because false teachers have infiltrated the church. This is the big thing he's worried about in 1 Timothy 3. And so our translation says men. He says some men have infiltrated the church. It's not men. So you have male pronouns, female pronouns, and pronouns that can be basically neuter gender and can include both. And that's actually what happens here. But again, because of bias, we write men in there because we think, oh, men are the one teaching the false gospel. But I'm like, we're in Ephesus. Don't lose sight of the fact women are running the show in Ephesus because of Artemis. And so he's already concerned about false teachers. And then the phrase house to house. This is the one that I think cracks me up. That phrase house to house is the same one Luke uses to describe going from church to church in Acts 2:46 and 5:42. That phrase house, there are no churches, they're houses. So if we go back and we say, hey, part of why I'm concerned about younger widows is they have been known to practice magic, and they're going from church to church. And I'm writing to you in the first place because false teachers have infiltrated your church. Suddenly there's this cohesive understanding of what's taking place here that accounts for what's happening in Acts. And what's fascinating, in the follow-up letter, Paul brings up magic again. Magic is not in the New Testament very much, but it's in 2 Timothy, it's in Acts, talking about Ephesus, and somehow we just don't translate it as magic in this one. Yeah.
How can a translation committee
get it so wrong? So I think this goes back to reading broadly and reading widely. I would say translation committees, so there's only a couple English translations that have females in the room, right? So if you've been your whole life told women are gossips and busybodies and they go house to house doing this, and you have an understanding of like 1950s housewives who are bored June cleavers, who did go house to house gossiping, that has infiltrated your imagination in such a way that it will require somebody like a Dr. Glahn to overrule it in such a big way. And if she's not in the room, or someone who thinks like her, again, this was 2021, right? There's been no new translations that I'm aware of. Hold on, CSB was 2019. I think it was 2019. So I can't think of a modern English translation that's as recent as her scholarship. Now, we shouldn't have to have her scholarship to say, why are you not translating as magic? That seems so obvious if in every other place. Now, part of it is, I think you just get used to what you think it is. And then misogyny. That's the other reason.
Part of it was they were, like, that word can be used for, like, magicians were, like, running their mouths and putting themselves in places they weren't supposed to be. Like, that's how they got there.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, and not only that, like, so one of the things that, if you're on a translation committee, this word here, I looked it up, is oikos ta oikos. The literal translation is house to house, right? So now we are supposed to interpret that as church to church. Like, but we don't, like when you think of your house, do you think of your church? No, I don't think of my church. And I know this. Like I think about the Roman Empire a lot for being a woman. Like I think about these things all the time. And so I think part of it is like one of the things the magicians did is they're known for like almost like babbling. So the reason why they burned their books is because it was like incantation. So don't think of like rabbit out of a hat. Think like hocus pocus, toil and trouble, like the words are all that. So that's part of like the gossip and like the running of the mouth idea. That's why they're so closely related. Because I remember, that's what Megan was like, how can the same word mean magic and gossip or busybody? And I'm like, well, because that's what magicians were basically doing. And I just have to wonder, like, what, did it work? Like, I'm like, I don't know. I'm just so like you pay a magician like $10 and whatever doesn't happen, I'd just be like, you're a snake oil salesman. But people are people, and we still have like hotlines for those reasons. So my aunt used to have do y'all remember Call Miss Cleo, the commercials? That would be, you might be too young, Jen, but like they'd be like,
I'm 45.
Okay. Maybe you just didn't watch enough TV. Maybe you need to watch more TV.
I was restricted.
Okay, there it is. So there was like an infomercial that was like, it was a woman with a Jamaican accent, whether it was real or not, I have no idea. Do you remember this? And she was like, call Miss Cleo, and I'm not going to do the accent because it'll feel offensive, but she's like, call Miss Cleo, and I will read you your fortune, essentially. And it was like a 1-800 number. And they told you like what it would cost. Like it was like 99 cents for the first minute, and then after that it was like $8.99 a minute, or I don't know, something like that. And I like think about that, and I'm like, yeah, there's nothing new under the sun. And I guarantee you that woman died a billionaire because like if you're running commercials, like, but it is like this is the hope, right? So you go back and say, okay, I don't know. The NLT is working on a new translation. I don't know what they're going to do. I do know 2 people on the translation committee. I'm going to ask. But I'm like, what would it take? Because I also think you put that out in the world and people are like, my Bible has always said gossip and busybody. What does it take to get you to say, no, the evidence here says magician? But I'm saying, I can't see it any other way. Or at least put a footnote that says busybody could also be a magician. See also Acts 19:19 and 2 Timothy 3. Because the fact that he has to mention magicians again in a follow-up letter, I'm like, something's happening here with magicians. And so this is why I think when he's talking about widows, I think he's talking about, hey, certain widows are not fit to serve the church. They're the very ones taking out the church right now. And so Paul is concerned about enrolling younger widows because they may not be as committed to the church as older, wiser women, and they're the ones going around church to church, some of them teaching magic and other nonsense they shouldn't even be discussing. So do you even want them in leadership? And so he's saying instead, so like vote on the older women, but the younger ones should marry, and then I read out, manage their household. But this word is actually oiko-despotin. Oikos is house, despot, like to be a despot, like to master. So what's fascinating is like we see this and we're like, younger widows just get married and like bake good bread and banana muffins and all that. And it's like, no, even when he tells them to do, he's like, be the masters of your home. He's telling these women like, go be forceful in this sphere. Because if you do that, he's saying like, it's not housekeeping. You're going to be a master. And by doing that, then the enemy will have no opportunity to vilify the gospel. In other words, if you are part of our community and you're going around church to church selling your little magic spells, we have a problem with the gospel. But he's not saying run away. He's not saying cast. He's saying, hey, go grow up, essentially, and become masters of your home. Because if you do that, you will become the kind of women that's on this list. You'll be women of one spouse. You'll be hospitable. You'll be all these things if you learn to be a master of your home. And I think and so like if we think about widows, not just as a woman bereft of a husband, but as like women who either never married, or maybe they were bereft of a husband, but they've been out doing magic and Artemis and all of that. And he's not saying, shove them in a corner and tell them to shut up. He's saying, let them become the kind of women that are in this passage, is what it seems like he's doing here. And so what if 1 Timothy 3, this saying is trustworthy and true is how he says it. And if anyone aspires to be an overseer, he desires a noble work. This is how 1 Timothy 3 should start. And he talks about, this is what it takes to be an overseer. This is what it takes to be a deacon. And now I think he's saying, this is what it takes to be a widow. And then he's going to go on after this and say, this is what it takes to be an elder. And what's interesting is there are other times where he talks about elders. He's like, rebuke them gently. And he's not talking about the office. He's clearly just talking about old drunk men in the church. So there are times that he uses the word for office, and then there are times that he uses it for this station. So we've seen this before. This is what I think Paul's doing in this letter. Widows who can be cared for by their families, do that. Like, we don't have, like, it's like every young woman, every young gifted, there's like 20 women at our church that could do my job. Like, truly. There's one position, though. So y'all go find other things to do is basically what I think Paul's saying to you guys. Like, y'all stay away from Nika's job. We have one. But I had to be voted on. Like, I had to be voted on and brought in and all of it. And so, like, so we don't have room for, we have room for 3 widows, right? Or whatever the list is going to be. And I think he's addressing both the station and the office. And so widows, if you can't be careful about your family, do that. Widows who are young and not good candidates because they cannot commit to Jesus fully or are currently false teachers, like, go become masters of your home. Go grow up, essentially, is I think what he's saying. It's the same thing he says, like let them learn. Like, let them go learn how to be faithful, is what he said in other places about women. And widows who are faithful, mature, and have a good reputation, put them on the payroll. Let them serve the body. And I think we were, like, really honestly see the beginnings of, like, this is how these women paid for their, like, they worked. They were on the church staff, so to speak. So, if this is what, like, this is biblical evidence. So how did the early church think of it is another question that we always have to look at. A book called Women and Men in Ministry said, the role of women in church ministry was simply not a burning question until it asserted itself in recent decades in conjunction with the modern women's movement. And this is just patently false. And this is what you'll see of everything written post-1970s. That's prior to, like, not mainline Christians, kind of got with the program in the 1960s, so they've been there. But, like, evangelical Christians, this is the garbage that comes out. And I call it garbage because there's no way you could do research and arrive at this conclusion. And so I want to be charitable to these authors. I didn't even put their names up there. But I'm like, there's no way you could say this wasn't even a question of women being in ministry until recently, because that's just simply not true. So we'll look at the evidence here. So again, going back to the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, widows, this is what it says. Widows are an institution that requires a time of testing, and what they mean by that is vetting, and be blameless. They cared for their families and of a certain age. In later orders, there were only to be 3 widows per congregation. So, like, later writings where they say, hey, we can only have 3 per congregation. And they're often listed with bishops, presbyters, deacons in the writings. So the writings are saying the same thing Paul's saying here, but making them an office, which is really fascinating. Because you can't, like, if you say there's 3 per church, that doesn't mean some woman whose husband passed away from cancer, you're like, sorry, we have our 3. Like, what would you do? Like, that's, yeah you're like, better not. Yeah. Tasks include prayer, caring for the sick, visiting prisoners, showing hospitality to traveling preachers. There's that hospitality piece again. And teaching women catechumens and Christian girls. And so, again, like, they're the women going, hey, you want to be a part of our church? Great. We would love to teach you what it means to be a Christian. You're talking about a high bar, like, you're trusting these women to basically teach, like, recent and new converts, this is what it means to be a faithful Christian follower. This is not just some old lady that you haven't vetted. Or a woman who shows up and is like, I need bread. And you're like, great, will you teach the Christian girls how to be a good Christian? Like, no, that's not what's happening here. And because of their work, they are highly honored and have a special place in worship on the left behind the presbyters, as deacons are on the right behind the bishops. So they even have, like, places of honor to sit, which that's garbage and we should have never done that. But it does tell you they were important. They received communion after the deacons and before the subdeacons, which is a funny way of saying parishioners. Yeah. Us. Yeah. Just the peons, you know. You're just, like, sitting there. You are a subdeacon, and you someday, if you aspire. But then they say, listen, but by the end of the early period, the order disappears, and it perhaps finds a new form in the monastic orders for women, for nuns, and they take up many of the duties. So again, like, later you see the Roman Catholic Church sort of pick up this office, but it's now evolved into priests and nuns is really what it looks like. Pope Paschal, he was a pope in AD 822. He has a mosaic of his mother, Theodora, labeled with the title Episcopa. That's bishopess. That's not even widow. And this is a pope. This guy's at the top. This is his mama. And the blue around her head suggests that she would have still been alive at the time of the Mosaic. So he's not even just giving her an honorary title, like she's dead, that's the highest, I love my mom. He's not some mama's boy that was like, hey, my mom meant everything to me. What's the highest title I can give her now that she's dead? And people say, oh, we don't really care what you call her because she's dead. No. Like he's saying my mom was a bishopess, which is wild. The Council of Trullo speaks of ordaining women deacons, which was the same term they use elsewhere to ordain priests and male deacons. So again, ordination being a part of it. The Synod of Orleans, attended by 32 male bishops. This is why you should always have a woman in the room. They're a little mad. Some girl broke one of their hearts, so it's fine. And so they say, women who have so far received the ordination to the diaconate against the prohibitions of the canons, if it can be proved that she have returned to matrimony, should be banned from communion. So they're mad about somebody getting married. But anyways, 32 men get in a room and you need a woman. Saint Remigius, I think is how you say it, makes mention of his deaconess daughter, Hilaria, in his will. The Synod of whatever, we abrogate the consecration of widows whom they call deaconesses completely from our region. So a bunch of men got together and they're like, we're done with the widows. But look at the date. I mean, they are the widows, right? Now, this also shows you, at some point, they collapsed deaconesses and widows into one office. And the way we understand the early one, it would have been overseers, widows, deacons, elders, kind of in this subset, but you would have had, like, widow would have been a higher role than a deaconess. And so over time, when they flatten that, that's a really interesting thing that they do. The Chalcedon, which is a really big council, the really big council where we talk about the nature of Jesus, it lowers the age for female deacons from 60 to 40. Now, again, there's only an age requirement on widows. So again, it's almost like they collapsed them and kind of used the same rules for them. The Synod of Orange, again, 17 male bishops. Women should always be in the room when decisions are made. But altogether, no women deacons are to be ordained. If some already exist, let them bend their heads to the blessing given to the lay people. Okay. Whatever. But again, you see this idea. There are women currently doing this. Now, it's fascinating because when you get to that book, who's like, oh, women in ministry was never a topic. I'm like, no, it always was a topic, and clearly a topic that's always frustrated men. Like, that's not new. And so I'm just like, what are you talking about? Some men, though, are like, I want to make a mosaic of my mother, or I want to mention my daughter, and then others are like, yeah, let's get rid of the women and let them bend their heads to the blessing. I'm like, you bend your head. You go first, butthead. And so... this testament, this is really beautiful. So it's an ordination prayer for a widow, and it appears under the heading Prayers of the Widows Who Sit in Front. And I brought it with me because it's so beautiful. But I want you to listen to, this is what would have been read over a widow as she's being brought into this office. This is so pretty. Holy and lofty God, who sees humble women, who has chosen the infirm and the powerful, who has created, O honored one, even those who are scorned. Impart, O Lord, a spirit of power upon this your servant. And in your truth, strengthen her, so that, fulfilling your commandment and laboring in your sanctuary, she may be for you an honored vessel, and may give glory on the day, O Lord, on which you will glorify your poor ones. Give to her power of happily practicing the teachings prescribed by you in the rule of your handmaiden. Give to her, O Lord, a spirit of humility, of power and patience and kindness, that she might, bearing your burden with ineffable joy, sustain her labors. Truly, Lord God, who knows our infirmity, perfect your handmaiden for the glory of your house. Strengthen her for edification and as a shining example. God, sanctify her. Make her wise and comfort her, because God our Father, your kingdom is blessed and glorious. And then the people say, amen. Like, that's what's written. Like, so the whole body. So this is like, if somebody would have read this over me at my ordination, I'd be like, ooh. And the fact that over and over again, it's like, give her humility and power. Like, that power is used multiple times in here. And I just think it's pretty incredible. And so that's 400 AD. So you're talking about like ordination prayers for these women. Tertullian ranked widows among the clergy and spoke of seats being reserved for them. But he's also annoyed because he's like, I know of a place where a virgin less than 20 years old has been placed in the order of widows. So he's like, he knows they exist, but he's like, stop breaking the rules, okay? So he's a rule follower. Robin, you would have liked Tertullian. But this is so Roger Grayson, he wrote Ministry of Women in the Early Church. And he's like, he's not an evangelical. He's like he's like really important. Hold on. He matters, and that's why I'm quoting him. He is a scholar with the Order of Saint Benedict in Belgium. So he's not even American. And this book, a book of his, was published in Liturgical Press in 1976. And he traces the office of widow and female deacon through the early church. So this is what his whole book is about. And this is what he says. He says, up to the end of the 19th century, historians of the early church often identified deaconesses and widows as if these two different titles corresponded, like as if they were one, for those who held them to the same function. And since deaconesses and widows obviously corresponded to quite different institutions, one can only wonder, after a close study of all the evidence, at the persistence of such an error. And so his point is no, like for those who keep saying like we had deaconesses, he's like, and widows, those are not the same. Those are separate offices. And then to go on, it says, since scholars have mostly ignored widow as an office, they ignored much evidence that showed widows in liturgy, prayer, and honored positions. So when they thought of it only as a station in life, when they would look at widow in the writings, the prayers, the photos, the pictures, they're like, oh, that's just like a woman, that poor old lady. And I'm like, some of them, they're not even old. Like, I mean, so this is part of his issue is he's like, you're almost like willfully denying the evidence because you refuse to see it as an office and you only see it as a station in life. By the 3rd century in the West, the office, so that's like Rome and all that, the office of the widow was described as a thing of the past, so it went faster there, probably because of nuns and things like that. So whenever Alexandrians mention women deacons or widows, they refer to these as offices of the past, not active. Both Clement and Origen occasionally recognized that women were placed in the service of the church in the time of the Apostle Paul, but these men did not indicate the office survived. In the East, widows and female deacons made a reversal such that widows who had once supervised female deacons become subject to them. And eventually offices in the East bore the same labels as those in the West, but in the West they were merely honorary, and the East was actually more conservative and segregated. And perhaps that, so the West is more liberal than the East, and we see that even in Catholic liturgy and theology compared to like Eastern Orthodox. But because, interesting, so you would expect them to have the women, but actually, because they're a little bit more liberal, they don't need women, men can do everything. But because they were segregated in the East, then you kept the office of widow because you needed women to minister to women because men wouldn't do that. So I remember one time I was supposed to pick up a Greek Orthodox priest who's the head librarian over Mount Catherine's monastery in Mount Sinai, Egypt. He's a guy from Texas. He went to the University of Texas. But now he's got like beard down to here, hair down to here, the Greek full. And so I was chosen to go pick him up from the airport. And then the day before I got a phone call and they were like, oh, he won't ride in a car with you. We just learned. And I was like, oh, I'll see y'all at the event. And so that is part of why in the East, though, they think perhaps women stayed in their roles a little bit longer. So like as infant baptism eventually replaced adult baptism, though, the need for women to be there to baptize other women went away. And so especially if catechumens were baptized in the new to symbolize rebirth. So if you're baptizing babies only, you don't need as many women in office because babies can be naked. So, oh no, adults too. Yeah, in the early church. Yeah, it was like a rebirth. So in the way you came the first time is the way you came this time, which is why they had like, it's fascinating, like you would have had most likely separate baptisms for the men and the women, and then they would wear white robes and then have celebratory affairs. Which is why, like, when people talk about did women in the early church, I'm like, yes. There is no way a God-fearing Jew who converts to Christianity baptizes a naked woman. Yeah. It's not happening. Like, you have, like, go tell a local rabbi that story and tell him what you think he would say to that. Like, it's just not going to happen. So what are the conclusions? Look, it is patently false. So I'm just going to, it is patently false to say women's ordination is a new topic brought about by the culture. It's just simply not. And if widow is a station and an office, we should be ordaining women into church leadership yesterday. And I think this is especially true in places like, are you at Irving? Obviously, yeah, Irving understood this early on, even before they fully went into having women preach and all that. Like, they were still offering the tax break to the women, right? Like, so these churches that have women on the payroll, the IRS tax code allows for there to be confirmation. So you don't have to be ordained. And then that gives you like a housing allowance so that you can afford to live on a ministry salary, which is not very much money most places. And churches don't do that. And I'm like, come on. And then to say when they're like, well, because of the Bible, I'm like, no, actually, I don't think you're going to get away with that. Also, what does the Bible have to do with the IRS? But whatever, that's just me. And so, yeah, I just think we need to take ordaining women a lot more serious. And I think churches need to get on this trend. Obviously, I think that. We should vet female leaders. So elder's wife is not a vetted position. So I see this in churches all the time, where you have the head pastor, or you have an elder, or you have men in leadership, and then their wives, or whatever, are given opportunities that they're either not ready for, or frankly, other women are looked over who have higher levels of maturity, commitment, and faithfulness. And so if right here we have an example of we're vetting these women and voted upon, I think this is healthy. Like, it was a nerve-wracking, I had already been pastoring St. Jude for 9 months. And then I had to stand up there on a Sunday and be like, so you all are going to vote whether or not I'm going to be your resident theologian. And that, I wasn't nervous, but I was like, yo, low key. Someone could raise their hand and say, I don't want her. And that, I wasn't worried that I was going to lose the vote. I just was worried it wasn't going to be unanimous. Some person was like, low key, I'm not an egalitarian. So I just got to vote my conscience here, which would have been fine. And I would have been proud of that individual, but that's not a good feeling. And yet, I think that's what's required of people who want to be in the position that I am in. And so I just think we should take that a lot. I think we should take women in our church more seriously. And if we're going to do that, this is how you do that. Women are to be masters of their homes. If you use 1 Timothy 5 to say, go home and bake bread, go home and rule your home is what it's saying. And I think this speaks to just how powerful women really are. This is the biggest so what, and this is what I want to tell especially single woman in the church. Single women do feel almost unseen, and they feel diminished. And they feel as if they don't have the same power and the influence of their male counterparts. And I believe Paul is arguing the exact opposite in this letter. I think he's so concerned about the effectiveness of those busybody magicians that he has to address it. If they're not very good and influential, I don't think they get space in the letter. But the fact that they're going from church to church and winsomely convincing people of this, so much so that Paul has to tell Timothy, shut it down, lock it down. I think women are far more capable teachers than they ever imagined. And so you're not worried about itty bitty gals going home to home if they're not influential. You're just not. You're just the women, they're gossiping at 3 o'clock tea again. God bless their hearts, right? No. And what's interesting is Paul, overwhelmingly in his letters to Timothy and to Ephesus, it's never don't teach the women. It's, hey, remove them from teaching and go teach, give them theology with the assumption that you're going to launch them back into this. And so I think if you were to ask Paul, hey, Paul, do you think women can be deeply influential in the church? He's like, yes. Women are extremely dangerous in the church, so give them good theology. And so, just like men are. I'm like, I don't think Paul sees any difference here. Vetting your leaders, I already did that one. Okay, so this was the question I wanted to end everybody with, and then we'll get to the final so-whats. If Grayson and Golan are correct, how long before it shows up in our translations? Because that's the question you asked earlier, which is a great question. And I'm hoping the NLT will have it in there. I don't know, but we'll see. And what's the impact of that? If suddenly women are taught, oh, you're not just gossiping busybodies, but you're like, hey, you guys are powerful magicians. And you have the ability to influence churches, so much so that Paul has to write to Timothy because he's concerned. What does that impact have on women? What does it have on our churches? What does that have on our translation? And then the question that I asked, I think is, for those of you at home listening, what's a good solution to get this teaching out? So I argued, when I taught this the first time, there was 15 people in the room? And so I was like, 15 people I might have convinced. I'm not going to take a vote because I'm not going to believe that I convinced you all. But that's 15. I guarantee you leave here and you go talk to any of your friends about this passage, and nobody's heard it taught like this unless they're hanging out with Dr. Klon or they were here. How do we get this out was the question I asked. And it was interesting. The solutions were we write songs, we write books, the solutions were really creative. I don't have answers. I just am this is just something that I was pondering. But I think it speaks to, at the beginning I said that I don't think there's any such thing as a plain reading of the text. And that's actually what I'm preaching on this Sunday at St. Jude. We titled this whole series, There's More Than Meets the Eye. And I think that is the posture that we should all have as we come to these texts. And if that's the case, we should not be surprised if our translations make leaps instead of nudges in their changes. It's a big change for the English reader to go from busybody to magician. Like, that means something completely different. But if that's what it means, jump. And so, I don't know. I'm gonna ask them though. I'm gonna ask them. Okay, elders, fine. I don't care about talking about men. So what? So the big so what? Women have been about the Lord's business for a minute. I am not new. This is the thing is like, people are like, oh, you're breaking the glass ceiling. I'm like, no, it was crushed a long time ago. Now, people put other barriers in the way because they didn't like it, but the glass ceiling is so much higher. I haven't done anything unique. Nothing is new under the sun. And so if that's true, and if it's in the scripture, I think we need to be training and employing and deploying more women in the ministry all the time. And I think when women feel gifted for the Lord, they should have a place and a space and an opportunity to use those gifts. Single ladies, you are so valuable to the kingdom of God. Whether you're single because you're bereft of a husband, whether you're single because you never took a husband, whether you're single because you want to be or single because you don't want to be, Paul's trying, he's like almost begging them to understand the impact that they can have. And he's telling Tim, bruh, watch out. And his solution is not banishment. His solution is train them. And so I just continue to think single women might be the greatest untapped potential. I mean, this is what Kat's whole ministry is with Polished, right? I think single women, and young women specifically, are the single greatest untapped potential within the American church. Really, any church, but other parts of the world use women like this. So I think we just have to continue to deploy women in our ministries. Married ladies, master your homes. Don't be a homemaker. Be a homemaker. I don't care. However you choose to master your home. But the call is not subservience. The call is ruler. Just the same call in Genesis 1. So nothing's changed from Genesis 1. It just got harder after Genesis 3. And then finally, fellas, brothers are precious. Would you please be our brothers? But we also know some brothers who really need dads. And so my call to young men is grow up. And my call to older men is help them grow up. Because if I'm going to be honest about the landscape of what I see in the church today, women are figuring it out and men are drowning. And so, we need older men to be dads, overseers, elders, all that good stuff. Any questions, you two? No, we're not doing that. We're not going to next week. Any questions? Did I answer everything that you can remember from the first one? All right, friends, if nobody's told you today that they love you, I do, but way more importantly, God does, and God thinks widows are in office. I've hopefully convinced you. If not, don't tell me. All right? Did I convince you? Maybe? Thank you.